Now it's time to take a look at some of the stories that are making the headlines in the media across the world. And we begin with The Guardian, which, like several of the other front pages, leads on the German Chancellor Angela Merkel's suggestion that an alternative to the Irish backstop plan could be found within 30 days. Mr Johnson has called for the backstop, which aims to avoid a return to physical checks at the Irish border, to be removed from any Brexit deal. Over on the Daily Mirror, they're reporting that Mrs Merkel has called the Prime Minister's bluff. It describes Mr Johnson as stunned in his reaction to the German Chancellor's demand that the UK must find a realistic alternative to the backstop. Now on to the Financial Times. It says that the cost of servicing debt in developed countries has sunk to its lowest level for more than 4 decades, and that a sharp decline is putting pressure on governments to borrow and spend more as a result in order to jumpstart a flagging global economy. The Copenhagen Post Online has this picture and this headline, talking about Germany picking up the pieces and the cost of Donald Trump's abandoned visit. Now onto the South China Morning Post, which has this picture of yet more chaotic scenes at the MTR station there, Yuanlong, protesters being confronted by police there. And finally, the BBC Online is reporting that there is a bid to keep the Nepalese region clean around Mount Everest. Apparently, they have banned single-use plastics in the region. The ban will take effect from January of next year. Well, let's begin with Brexit, shall we? Rolake, thanks very much for coming back and going through some of these pictures and these stories. Let's start with this one in The Guardian. It's interesting, isn't it? Merkel giving the PM here a 30-day deadline to avert a no deal. What do you make of this? Is this an olive branch or is this an ultimatum?
Most people appear to have interpreted it as an ultimatum. She actually alluded to the fact that it would be great if a deal could be struck. Of course, we know the key sticking point here is around the Irish border and what happens with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, obviously. Boris Johnson is quite optimistic in his approach, given what the French have said. Macron, for instance, believes there will the most likely outcome is no deal. He seems to think he can, conjure up something in a few days. And one possibility, actually, thinking about it, is those MPs who voted against a hard line, saying that the only way a backstop would be feasible is if Britain could decide to withdraw from such an agreement unilaterally, and if there was a time limit on the Irish backstop. I think those are elements that could possibly strike up a compromise. But obviously, this is a key talking point, the first such meeting with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister and one of the biggest voices in the EU on this matter.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I wonder whether or not he'll find quite such a diplomatic welcome when he goes to France today. I mean, President Emmanuel Macron has emphasised that renegotiation at this point is not an option.
No, and if both sides, if Britain and France dig their heels in, Boris Johnson wants the removal of the backstop, France is saying no, that's going to be a very tough one and a very different picture from the camaraderie we appear to see here between Merkel and Johnson.
The Daily Mirror very much going with this this idea that it is in fact some form of ultimatum, and actually Germany has put the ball very much in Boris Johnson's court, saying it's really up to him to come up with a solution. I mean, what do you think of that? Apparently they're calling him stunned and vowing to stick to what he has described as a blistering timetable.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, October is not very far away, so he's under a great deal of pressure. And now they have put the ball firmly in Britain's court to come up with a solution. Johnson seems to think he has one in the bag. We haven't really seen the makings of that, but I suspect we will fall somewhere between what may try to negotiate and what he actually wants.
Okay, let's talk about this story. This is interesting in the Financial Times. Now, I mean, it's pretty much thought of around the world that we are facing some form of global economic downturn, isn't it?
Yeah.
The questions are how slow or low will it go, and what, if anything, can be done about it, and by whom. We've got the central bankers gathering at Jackson Hole, haven't we, soon. And the big question is whether or not government should launch into fresh stimulus and and borrow whilst rates are so low in order to jumpstart the economy. I mean, what do you make of that as a plan or a strategy?
I mean, it sounds, the principle behind that is actually sound. But if you think about it, I think there were some figures released earlier in the week around the fact that we've seen debt to GDP ratios of developed countries reach 76%. Now, you borrow when interest rates are low, but that depends on the quantum of debt you already have.
Right.
Because should the markets then change, then you're probably faced with major economic headwinds. The other issue around is investors increasingly seeing government bonds as a safe haven, which is another factor that has driven down yields on bonds. But let's also not forget the factors that are actually causing sluggish growth in the global economy. Those factors are not going to go away. One example is the US-China trade war. So you might take action now in the hope that rates will stay low, but what happens further down the line, that's not really going to impact global growth. And here we're also seeing the makings of what quantitative easing has done to distort markets around the world. We saw that with the US Fed in terms of moves. We're seeing that in Europe and, of course, in the UK. And that has had the impact of pushing down rates over the long term. And I think we'll really need to think of other solutions to kickstart the global economy. But obviously, from a borrowing perspective, invest in infrastructure and other perhaps fiscal moves may actually happen in the short term.
It's going to be an interesting one, and whether or not, as a result of QE, we're now stuck, with fewer options, because if interest rates are so low, there's nowhere to go in terms of monetary policy. What are you going to do unless it is boost up your fiscal policy
boost up fiscal policy, and when you consider the fact that 15 trillion of government debt is now negative yields, Germany being a very, very good example, that's a really worrying situation.
Now, the Copenhagen Post has got this headline: Trump cancellation, a huge cost to Denmark, and a big picture of the baby blimp. Trump has been accused of being childish. Now, Donald Trump has cancelled his trip to Denmark over remarks made by the Danish Prime Minister in response to his suggestion that he might buy Greenland. I'm not sure who is really being childish here, but obviously in terms of Copenhagen and the cost to Denmark, they've had to draft in police from all over the country in order to facilitate this visit. And we know in terms of his visit to the UK last year, it cost at least £10 million from the public purse. So, it's not an insubstantial sum, him pulling out less than 2 weeks to go.
No, it's not an insubstantial sum. I mean, it's a state visit. I mean, imagine all the preparations and investment that goes into making a state visit. And let's not also miss the fact that Denmark is potentially an important ally in NATO for the US. So it's a very unfortunate circumstance, but not too surprising given what has pertained in recent times. And the issue around purchasing Greenland, I guess, is thinking like a businessman. As far as the Danish are concerned, it makes no sense whatsoever. And it's not really a main point on the agenda for this particular state visit that's now being cancelled. So an unfortunate and, quite frankly, a very bizarre circumstances.
Bizarre and expensive. Let's talk about South China Morning Post. I mean, we've had 3 months of social unrest, haven't we, in Hong Kong and the like. I mean, much of it has been peaceful, as we said. But of course, we are looking at the 1-month anniversary of violence breaking out at this station where commuters were attacked. And you probably remember those awful pictures. Yet no one has been charged as a result of that a month on. I mean, where are we with this?
I mean, Hong Kong is a really interesting one. What we're seeing is widespread disaffection from a particular demographic, the youth demographic. If you think about the turn of events going back to 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back as a special administrative territory to China, part of that was what were the democratic dividends going to be? And we're seeing a series of government moves in recent times to sort of dilute that. 2014, we saw the protests over electoral reform. Now we're seeing protests around this it started with an anti-extradition bill. And I don't think this problem is going to go away. The issue is what is the response? And using force, brute force, is obviously not going to be very productive. I suspect this will probably be prolonged. There's also talk, maybe a bit extreme, of China taking some sort of action. It doesn't take long for Chinese troops to get into Hong Kong, but a very sensitive situation. And I really think there now needs to be dialogue between the authorities and the mass movement.
I think you're absolutely right. And certainly at the moment, a story that will continue to run. Rolake, thank you so much for coming in and running through the stories. We have now run out of time, but it's a pleasure to have you on the programme.
Thank you.